Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the latest episode of In Conversation with Lee Ryder. Lee is back on Tyneside after a whirlwind few days in Australia, and we'll briefly talk about that in a moment. But today's episode is going to concentrate on Newcastle United's retained list and those players who have now left the club, namely Paul Dummett and Matt Ritchie. Now, Lee, I've just mentioned there you were in Australia, a fantastic few days, but probably the one main thing to come out of the final press conference with Eddie Howe in Melbourne was about the futures of Paul Dummett and Matt Ritchie, where he hinted to you that the curtain might be coming down on their career, and it has indeed come down.
Yeah, it was something that kind of stood out in the press conference the other day. You know, we've seen managers kind of just sort of try to sort of gloss over stuff, but he kind of just said, look, they're out of contract, and he all but confirmed that, it could be over. And then obviously what happened with the FA Cup final, unfortunately, I think that proved to be the sort of final act of this situation, and the two players move on. But I mean, there was a couple of hints as well in Australia, if you look back, when they were laying the flags out at the MCG. I've interviewed Dan Byrne, and he was very emotional after that game against Spurs and said it was the last dance for some players. So there were a few hints. So it was starting to come to that conclusion that they weren't going to stay any longer. So yeah, good luck to them. Both great professionals, great lads, and I'm sure whatever they do next in their career will be a big success.
Yeah, we're going to go into a little bit of depth about Matt Ritchie and Paul Dummett's time on Tyneside and talk about the other players who've also been released, Loris Karius, Kell Watts and Jeff Hendrick. And we'll also say goodbye to Newcastle United. But just briefly, Lee, Australia, I mean, like I say, a whirlwind a few days, plenty of travel from you from Tyneside to Brentford to Australia and back to Newcastle again. Have you recovered yet?
Well, the first couple of days back were good because I got back at sort of the evening time, so I was able to get a good night's sleep when I got back. I can definitely feel that I've been to the other side of the world and back, but I'm not doing too bad, thanks. Hopefully, as the days go by, I'll get back to exactly where I should be.
And just on Australia, we talked about it in your last episode over there about some of the criticism that's come Newcastle United's way about this tour. Was it worth going over? And then obviously getting thumped 8-0 wasn't a good look. We've had in the last couple of days Amanda Staveley, corner of Newcastle United, come out with a statement on Instagram defending the trip. I'll just read it out for those who haven't seen it or just like a quick refresh. She said, I've seen a lot of comments about Newcastle's Australia trip, which I'd like to address. Besides being a shareholder, I am first and foremost a fan. And as a fan, I understand that this trip was controversial. However, personal opinions aside, revenue generating trips are crucial to a club's commercial success. The decision to go was taken by management, and ultimately, I have to support their decisions. Nobody wants a fresh team ready for the new season more than me. And we are doing everything we can to support our manager in achieving this. We are united. Before I get your thoughts on that actual statement, I mean, just the fact that Amanda Staveley's felt the need to come out suggests that the noise being created by some, maybe even the comments from Eddie Howe a few weeks ago about this trip, Q and Trippier as well, that noise has been heard by the upper the upper level of Newcastle United.
Yeah, and I think noise is a good way of describing it. People see things or hear things and they jump on them very quickly. They're quickly to post. But ultimately, there's a big project going on at Newcastle and they're trying to take the club to the next level. You won't get the next level if you don't think big. And that trip was thinking big, believe me. And I think it was one of them where you had to be there almost, because to see the networking events and to see the fans gathering en masse and to see people, as we've already said on this podcast, to see people in tears because they're seeing the team for the first time, meeting the players for the first time, you can't really buy that experience. It was controversial probably because of the distance and the timing of it, but I think I don't think you could take it away from anybody. Big clubs have done it before. Man City have done it. AC Milan are in Australia at the moment. Roma are in Australia. So if you want to be a big club and move on, you have to do things like this and connect with your fan base. So yeah, it's been a controversial one in some ways, but in other ways, I can see exactly why they've done it.
Yeah, and Amanda Savory there mentioned about how crucial these trips are to to making revenue for the club, generating revenue into the bank accounts and what have you. And she's absolutely spot on there, isn't it? It's all about growing the revenue. And now that Newcastle have not got European nights to do that, to bring the money in from the TV deals that you would get playing in Europe, and I mean just playing in Europe in general. I mean, especially the Champions League is very lucrative. Not so much in the Conference League, but you would still have money coming in through the gates and potential sponsorships. The trip to Australia actually might be worth a lot more than first considered.
Yeah, I think there will be a big check coming Newcastle's way for going over there, but I think definitely the supporters that's got to be considered the highest, because these are you're retaining customers almost. I don't like to use the term customers, but it's almost like a music star posing for a selfie with a fan. They know that they're now going to buy every album you're going to produce, and I think it's similar with football, that if you go out and you connect with people, they never forget it. And I think that's definitely going to be the case for the supporters that were over there. And I think the club, it will pay dividends, and I think they'll be back there at some stage. I don't think it'll be anytime soon. I don't think it'll be for pre-season, obviously, but I think at some stage in the next few years, Australia will be back on the menu, and they know now they've got a big fan base out there.
Certainly. So, right, let's get into the main part of this episode then. That is the goodbyes to Paul Dummett, Matt Ritchie, Lewis Karius, Kell Watts, and Jeff Hendrick. We'll start with Paul Dummett, a Manly that you've got to know really well over the last few years. I mean, he's been at the club 23 years, joined at the age of 9, 213 competitive appearances. How do you think he's feeling this morning? I mean, he would have known days ago, but now it's official. Now it's out in the open. Now it's public. How do you think he's feeling about this news?
Yeah, I think emotional is the word. I think he's a player that, first and foremost, is a credit to himself. He's a credit to his family, and he's a credit to the club academy as well. And really, he's an example of a local lad done good. And also he's a great example. He's almost like a mental health ambassador as well, because he's gone through an era where players have been fully exposed to criticism more than they ever have before. His career sort of started during the Twitter era, and he's dealt with all of that and just shrugged it off, gone and played under a number of managers, top class managers as well, some of them. And I think he's had a contract of every manager. He's been part of many squads. And what more can you say? I mean, he's a player that probably deserves legendary status in some ways, because there'll be players down the years that have been at Newcastle, not made much impact, not been prepared to fight for the place. But he's done all of that in droves, and good luck to him. And I think, in future years, you might see him back at the club in a different capacity. But I think he's probably still got a bit of playing time to do before that even starts.
And I mean, look, his appearances this year have been very few, but he has had some great games to kind of go off into the sunset with the performances against Man City and Man United, particularly in the League Cup. I mean, that's not a bad way to see your final season out in Newcastle, is it?
No, not at all. I think he probably would have liked to play more this season, and there were times where he probably didn't get on the pitch where he deserved to. But ultimately, again, the professionalism, never complained, never moaned, never kicked up a fuss. was always the team player and around to support his teammates and squad mates. So I think you've got to give him a lot of credit for that. He could have probably left Newcastle 2 years ago maybe and got another 100 appearances under his belt elsewhere. He's still young enough to do that if he wants to. He's probably still got another. I mean, players go on and play up until they're nearly 40 these days, but you'll have to wait and see what comes next for him. But certainly a reliable player and someone who, as I say, has been an ambassador for the region and an ambassador for the club.
Yeah, I think there was some brief interest from Ipswich back in January, so maybe you'll have a decision to make this summer if indeed Ipswich could come back in from another club would like him, because it'll be a big move for him to move away from Tyneside, won't it? You know, he's known little else. Well, he hasn't. You know, he's been 23 years. He had that loan deal at Gateshead, but otherwise it's pretty much been Newcastle United since then. So even at 32, it would be a big step for him to move elsewhere, especially if it is a team like Ipswich, you know, hundreds of miles away.
Yeah, I think what he's got is he's got the temperament to play somewhere else. I mean, obviously, he went and played for Gateshead on loan. He went up to St Mirren and won the League Cup up there. He's played for Wales, so he does know life outside of Newcastle a little bit. He has experienced other things, but I think ultimately for him, it's about. I think we'll see him now succeed wherever he goes because he's got that kind of professional mentality about him. I mean, the greatest tribute you can pay to players is their attitude, and I think you do see players come through the system where, as a local journalist especially, where they'll talk to you when in the reserves or going through the system, but then they'll suddenly get a whiff of the kind of the big time, or someone will say in that ear, don't bother talking to them. But he never kind of moved away from the same character he was. You know, a local lad, humble, down to earth, and he would always stop and talk. And I think that's attitude and not having an ego is a big thing in football. It's a rare thing, and I think he's demonstrated that all the way through.
Do you think he'll still? Could he still do a job in the Premier League as a first-team player? If Ipswich do come in, could you see him potentially being, you know, a first choice? I suppose it would be centre back, other than over left back at probably this stage of his career. But could he still cut it in the first team at a Premier League club? Do you think?
I think he could certainly be a Premier League squad member for somebody, and he could definitely play in perhaps a squad rotation system, something like that. Outside of that, we'll have to wait and see what his next move is, but certainly there'll be players and clubs who would, you know, be guaranteed games in the Championship. He's already shown he can do that with Newcastle. Scottish Premiership as well. I mean, there might be a few little bites there as well, but we'll have to wait and see what his next move is. But wherever he goes, he'll be able to compete, and he'll be a big part of the dressing room moving forward.
And one of the big debates about Paul at Newcastle was he better at left back? Was he better at centre back? And what we saw was really a kind of a player who adapted maybe to how his body was feeling, in terms of maybe he didn't have the pace to be at left back as often as he was back in his younger days. And then he went to centre back, where, to be fair to him, Lee, he looked right at home at centre back. We mentioned there the games against Manchester United and Man City, but they're just two examples of where he performed really well as a centre back, as opposed to being out on the left.
Yeah, I mean, the Man City game was a great example. The Man United game, I mean, how many players can step on the pitch after hardly playing for weeks and weeks and put in a polished performance like he did that day, you know? So, look, I think he could play in the middle. He could probably still play left back. I think I think the greatest testament you can pay to him is that he's been available to play in the last 2 years. He hasn't been injured. That's not why he hasn't been involved. He's been there, and he's put himself through training day in, day out. So I think he's certainly going to have a lot to offer his next club.
And I mean, he's just been living his dream, hasn't he? He's been living the dream of a Newcastle United support, and it doesn't get much better than that for him. And he's done it, and he can leave the club with his head held high.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it probably won't dawn on him yet. It'll probably take a while. He's been at the club since the year 2000, so he's been there since he was 7. So, that's a lot of people you're going to come across in a football club. It's a lot of coaches, it's a lot of players, and it'll probably take him a while to process it. Might take him a good while, but I think eventually there'll be a day where he sits back down and think, you know what, didn't do too bad there at all. And good luck to him, because, as I say, he's got a great attitude, and that's why he survived so long.
You mentioned there one of the biggest compliments you can pay him is his attitude, and I guess people who listen to this will be asking one question of you, Lee, and it is about the player ratings. And we discussed this in a previous episode, but it has kind of followed your player ratings around, and that is, Paul Dummett 7, a consistent, very good mark. I mean, just saying that out loud, I mean, that's what he was. He was a number 7. He was consistently good.
Yeah, I mean, I think any player who's a model of consistency is going to get a 7. A lot of games, and I think really for him, he'll probably be a player remembered for his effort. And I think if you see a player give an effort, then they're guaranteed a 7 most games. But I've spoken about before. I think it was Ben Dawson at the academy, basically using it as an example on one of his presentations, saying if you can strive, it's lovely to be a superstar, but if you can strive to be a player who's going to get 7 out of 10 every week, then you've got a chance of success in Newcastle United. And Paul Dummett, he's certainly done that, but there was a few fiery debates along the way.
Now, you only scored 4 goals at Newcastle, and I can't remember all 4 off the top of my head, Lee. You might be able to, but I do remember the one against Manchester United. I think it was it a long range effort, which stands out. I mean, is it out of the 4? If you can't remember them off the top of your head, which one stands out for you?
Well, obviously, he scored on his Premier League home debut against Liverpool, and I don't think he could believe what he'd done, really, because that's everybody's dream to score at the Gallagher end, and he's gone and done it. And yeah, that was his first goal. Man United goal was in the 3-3 draw. If you remember, he scored one at Crystal Palace in the League Cup to help Newcastle get through that night. And the other goal came in front of no crowd, which was against Leicester City in a 4-2 win at the King Power Stadium. So, I do remember having a conversation with him just in the lead up to the Sunderland game, and he was desperate to get on that pitch that day, and he did get on in a derby and won. So he tasted that, but I think he was dreaming of scoring a goal at the Stadium of Light, and that would have been some sight to see. But he did score a goal against Sunderland in the under-18s, which I know means a lot to him as well. So he's had a career where he can look back and cherish it. But don't forget, he's done many unbelievable defensive things as well. I think the big takeaway will probably be the overhead kick clearance off the line at Bournemouth. And yeah, I think that'll be on his highlights reel. So he's had a great career, let's be honest.
I think the fact that we go away from his career at Newcastle, and probably the other thing that springs to mind, aside from the number 7 in the player ratings, is just the good old sliding challenge. That's what Paul Dummett was famous for at Newcastle United. The good old straight into them, might take a bit of the man, but you'll always get most of the ball. And that's what I remember him as a player who played for Newcastle.
Yeah, well, don't forget as well, he actually upset a whole country when he took Luis Suarez out before the World Cup and became public enemy number 1 in Uruguay, and his Twitter account went absolutely mental that day, and he found himself right under the microscope for his challenge on Suarez. So I think it's a life well lived for him, and yeah, he moves on to the next part. Which, if he puts the same amount of passion and effort into it, then great things can happen for him.
And he captained Newcastle United as well. He really has lived the dream as a boyhood Newcastle United fan, playing for his club. Matt Ritchie, the other big name to be leaving Newcastle United again. Not a massive surprise given everything we've already spoken about and what Eddie Howe had to say in Australia. Joined in 2016 from Bournemouth, 215 appearances for Newcastle, 25 goals. But we'll start with his final goal, Lee, because it was a very, very important one. A very late equaliser against Bournemouth back in February, came off the bench, trademark corner flag celebration. If you're going to score a goal in dramatic fashion, and it's going to be your final goal for your club before you depart, that's not a bad one to go out on.
No, not bad at all. And Matt Ritchie joined the club. You knew straight away he had a good attitude. He joined the club when the club had been relegated, so he was prepared to walk away from a Premier League team and come and join a Championship team. So that for me was the first early sign that he was going to be a good hard battling player. I am never afraid to tell you what he thinks. I've had some conversations with Matt Ritchie down the years, which some of it will remain between me and him. And all I can say about him is that he cares for the club, he cares for the fans, and he's got a lot. He actually has a lot of respect for the local press. And I certainly remember it was actually in China, and it was before or after one of the press conferences over there about 5 years ago, and it was when Newcastle didn't have a manager, and he kind of like spoke to me and a colleague and said that you guys are important now because Rafa's gone. There's a massive void, but the coverage needs to stay as positive as it can do because we've got a new manager coming in, and all the players have agreed to get behind him because it's the right thing for the club, and perhaps you guys might want to join us doing that as well. And he really cared about the club. He didn't want to be relegated again. He wanted to make sure that the message was right, and we spent it was a good hour talking. It was all off the record as well. It was just him being the nice guy that he is, but also a very passionate one. And if he stepped out of line, in his opinion, he would let you know. So he'd be a big miss.
He certainly will be, and you can see how much the club meant to him in that celebration alone back in February. I remember sitting in the press box, and he must have been either injured or suspended for whatever reason. He wasn't playing. I think it was a pre-season friendly actually, and he was sitting a few rows behind, and he was just kicking every single ball that was being kicked on the pitch. You could hear him muttering away, getting angry, like an actual second manager in many ways, but from the vantage point of the press box. And that always stayed with me because you hear stories about the standards that he sets in training, and Eddie Howe has spoken. There's been a video released by the club about how well Matt Ritchie trains during the week, ultimate professional. I mean, really, Lee, the few players have set higher standards than Matt Ritchie, and if you fell under them on the training pitch, as you've just alluded to there, you would probably know about it from Matt Ritchie.
Yeah, as I said, never want to keep his thoughts to himself, rightly or wrongly. He would tell you what he thought, and I think that's a great thing. I think in life that people can actually, say what they're feeling. Obviously, we have to sometimes think about what we're saying, but he very much was a passionate guy. For me, he'll always go down as a player and a human being for me that cared about the situation. So he'll probably not be in everyone's greatest Newcastle 11, but I think if he had to put a squad together, then he might get into some people's squad.
Yeah, in terms of the effort and commitment, there's no doubt, and what he brought to the club. And I guess with him, again, he's not had much game time in the last kind of couple of seasons, but every time he's come on the pitch, he's handled it really well. He's handled the situation really well. And again, I think what Newcastle will miss the most from him is the attitude, is what he brings to the training pitch. And Eddie Howe had a trusted lieutenant there with him, and he's gone now. And I mean, that's the question I want to ask you about both of these, really, because two natural leaders, Matt Ritchie, very vocal, Paul Dummett, maybe not as loud in your face, but he was a man that would deliver the message about what it means to play for this club and the importance of the fans, etc., etc. So not only are you losing two members of the squad who are decent players, but probably more importantly, you're losing two members of the squad who are leaders and are vocal. How does Eddie Howe go about replacing that?
Well, I think that's when Eddie Howe done his original draft for the squad for next season. I think Paul Dummett and Matt Ritchie were actually on it. And then things have kind of changed with finances and budgets. And I don't think he's been able to, almost get what he wants from that point of view. And the decision's been made to almost look at the squad. So I think that's got to be considered. So whoever comes in now will need to have the temperament and experience that can replace the two big guys that have left. So hopefully Eddie can do that. I'm sure he can. But they will be hard to replace. From the outset, people will look at it and say, well, he didn't play. But that's not how a football squad works on a day-to-day basis. It works very different to that. It works on the standard set in training. If someone's stepping out of line in the dressing room, you've got someone who can come in and maybe advise them and say, look, I wouldn't do that again. Or, and I think there's a couple of young players coming into the squad this season, people like Lewis Miley. And I know that Matt Ritchie's been a player that's almost mentored him through the season. It's little things like that people don't always see and can be hard to replace. So hopefully that can be something that we see in terms of signings this season.
Yeah, it's a really important point you made there about Matt Ritchie. I've done a bit of work with a few of the youngsters in Newcastle United squad over the last year or so, and I always ask them, is there one player who does put an arm around the shoulder, does come and try and mentor you? And Matt Ritchie was often the answer more than most, about just coming over and having a little word or trying to help them settle in that first team squad. So, their influence is going to be a big, big miss. And just looking at that Championship squad that went up under Rafa Benitez, if I'm not mistaken, only Jamal Lascelles and Isaac Hayden are left now, and you would suspect Hayden will be gone in the summer, so we'll be left with just Jamal Lascelles. So it's quite a big moment, isn't it? It's the changing of the guard, sort of.
Yeah, today has felt like that. It has felt like things have sort of, for the first time since the takeover. I mean, we've seen people get off one by one, but today, to lose two long-serving characters like that, this feels like a significant sort of moment in the evolution almost. And there's not many players left now from that era. And certainly with Jamal Lascelles being injured, he's not going to kick off the season. So it's going to be pretty much a complete change around and new faces to come. And who knows, there might be a couple more that leave before then. There could be more familiar faces go in what's going to be an intriguing summer.
But the right decision for you, Lee? I know it had been European football. It might have been a different decision, but Newcastle aren't in Europe. So the right decision to see these two go, great servants, but time for them to move on?
Well, to be honest, I think if Newcastle got into Europe, then I do think they'd have been around, and I do think they would have been involved. It's hard to hold on to players who are maybe only going to play a couple of substitute appearances and play in the early rounds of the League Cup. But I think Europe would have been especially the Europa Conference League, with it being long-winded, I think it would have been an opportunity for them both to play, and I think they would have played. So, yeah, I don't think it's as easy as saying it's time for them to go. I think a decision's been reached. I think there's been a lot of discussions have gone on, and maybe it's if they do want another chapter in their career. I know Matt Ritchie's going to be close to going into coaching very soon. I know Paul Dummett's got an eye on coaching as well. They've both already started doing the badges and stuff like that, and they've already got their own coaching school here on Tyneside. Let's not forget that. I think for Paul Dummett, he probably believes he's got a few more years left in him to play, so that's got to be all factored in. And I think Newcastle have just made a decision. They've made decisions themselves. They haven't exactly gone away disgruntled. They've gone away almost celebrating what they had, and that sums up them both as players and guys.
Yeah, accepting that maybe now is the right time, or at least accepting the club's decision. I guess we've also seen Eddie Howe be a bit ruthless, because, as you say, in an ideal world, he probably would like to have kept them, but the situation scenario hasn't allowed that. So he has been ruthless and maybe made a choice that he didn't necessarily want to make. Luis Karius, Lee, just briefly on him, again, no surprise. It was kind of reported back in February time or so that he probably would be heading back to Italy to be with his partner, and I think their newborn or their newborn is imminent. So no surprise there. But look, he came in when Newcastle needed a goalkeeper, had the shock appearance in the League Cup final where he could do nothing about the goals that were conceded. One of those who, we didn't see a lot of, but one of those who handled himself really well, and it seemed to train just as well as Matt Ritchie on the training pitch, even though he knew he wasn't going to get much game time. And when we talk about attitude, you can't say fairer than that.
No, I think he was another player that come in and set standards in training. Probably did it in a more quiet way than others have. But, as you say, that Carabao Cup final, nothing could be blamed on him on that day. I think he came in and he was a model professional. He, knew it was going to be tough, but ultimately he's a player of experience and moves on, probably with good wishes. And he'll probably end up being a pub quiz question in about 10 years' time. Who was Newcastle's Carabao Cup final goalkeeper? Because it might be a little bit of a teaser for some people, that one.
Well, remember, he was one of only 2, maybe 3 players that stopped after that final, because me and you were down in the mix zone. Right. Not many wanted to stop, but he came out and he spoke to us and spoke about the game and his disappointment and what an opportunity it was for him. So we wish him well. Jeff Hendrick, again, no surprise to see him going. I suspect a few people might be left scratching their heads and thinking he was still part of the club. He's been on loan at various places. I think the last one was the QPR then Reading, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, somewhere like that. No surprise to see him cut adrift.
No, I don't think he's really been given a fair sort of coverage from some people. I think he signed for the club. We were all happy when he signed for the club because he was a good free transfer coming from Burnley, scored on his debut at West Ham. And I don't think he's a player that really let Newcastle down when he was on the field. So I think there's a lot of unfair things that have been said about him. For me, it was just, right club for him at the wrong time. But ultimately, he'll be a player that, will attract negativity. And I don't think some of that's fair, because I think he's a professional player who's gave his all for the club. And ultimately, it just hasn't worked for him. And now he'll find a new club. Maybe it's good that he's finally at the end of the contract with Newcastle and he can focus clearly on where he's gone next. But through it all, I think he kept getting called up for the Republic of Ireland squad. So he's obviously a player of a certain standard who can go away and do a job for another team. So good luck to him.
Yeah, his last caps came only last year for the Republic of Ireland, and he's been on loan at Sheffield Wednesday in the Championship. Before that, Reading, where he played 45 times last season, scoring 4 goals. But you are right. I mean, I was happy when he signed for Newcastle. I mean, he'd been courted by Milan and Roma, but Steve Bruce persuaded him to come to Tyneside. 22 appearances in his first season, 2 goals, and then he ended up going off to QPR on loan the season after. Just one of those where I agree with you, actually. I think probably the right club, just at the wrong timing for what Newcastle United were looking to build at that time in the market they were in. It was a very good signing, and it just didn't work out. The final name I want to talk about, Lee, is Kell Watts, because we look at Alex Murphy and a few others who we tipped to make it into the first team in the years to come. Kell Watts was on that list not so long ago. Always looked like he had something about him when we got to see him play, and just rocked, wasn't he, by that injury that has really kind of derailed his career, because I think without the serious injury he picked up, and I think it was a knee injury, if I'm not mistaken, someone might correct us, but it was a bad injury. I genuinely think without that injury, he'd still be, involved in Newcastle United.
Look, it's a bit like the Jeff Hendrick situation. The club Newcastle are now and where they're trying to be is completely different to when Jeff Hendrick signed and to when Kell Watts broke through from the academy to the sort of first team ranks. I remember Kell Watts, Newcastle had probably the best run in we'll call it the AFL trophy because it's had a few different names. Probably the best run in that, and I remember watching him. He could play centre half, he could play central midfield, he could play as a number 10, and he was this big imposing figure who was tipped to go on and be, a big player for Newcastle. Now, the fact that he's gone to a place like Wigan and Peterborough and walked into their teams when he hasn't been injured, of course, in block games for them, says to me that this is a guy who knows the game and is going to go on and have a successful career. And that this is probably the right thing for him now at this time. But it's such a small window of opportunity at a football club. Going from that kind of reserve team window, and then you kind of move on to where you could get in the first team, you might be unlucky and not get in. It's such a small window of opportunity for these guys. And Kell Watts is really unfortunate because there was probably a time where he could have almost got on that elevator and kept going, and he could have easily done what Paul Dummett's done and played 200 games for the club easily, but it just hasn't. Things haven't fell in that way for him, and I think sometimes you do have to have a little bit of luck. You've got to have the good attitude, you've got to have the consistency, but you've also got to have a bit of fortune as well with anything you do. Sometimes you can make your own luck, but for him, I think he was just a little bit unfortunate that he didn't quite catch the step moving up the elevator at the right time. So it wouldn't surprise me if he goes on and becomes a very good player at championship level, and you never know. We've seen players end up at a Premier League club and be big signings there, so let's see what he can do.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And yeah, it was a knee injury that kept him out between July the 15th, 2022 and October the 1st, 2022. It was 78 days there. And then that injury he picked up for Peterborough, and Achilles tendon contusion, getting off for 110 days. So he's not had the best of luck with injuries in this season. Actually on loan at Peterborough 2022-2023, only picked up 7 appearances. So if he can get past those injuries, then I think you're right. I think he'll probably have a very good career, either kind of League One Championship level. But speaking to someone who trained them outside of the Newcastle United Academy, because what young players usually, or some young players do, they will train during the day at the academy, and then they might pick up extra bits through another coach outside it. And he just said his attitude was unbelievable, and he'd often pop back to the classes that this guy was coaching, other youngsters, new youngsters, and sign autographs and come in and talk to them. And he said that made the world of difference. And he was a guy playing for Newcastle, at least in the first team squad, but always making time to come back to his roots, which I think speaks volumes about Kell Watts. So we do wish him well. I mean, Lee, any final thoughts on Paul Dummett and Matt Ritchie leaving? How would you sum up their time? I guess that's where we'll go. In a sentence, we'll start with Paul Dummett. How would you sum up his time at Newcastle?
Yeah, well, it's end of an era stuff, isn't it? That's where you would look at it. I think for me, he's going to be a player who Newcastle fans will miss, because he'll easily be a player that, when we look down the years, you look at players like Steve Watson, Lee Clark, those were the guys who were the local boys doing what everybody wanted to do. And Paul Dummett's probably a modern equivalent of that. So hopefully people look back with a lot of positivity about him. And same with Matt Ritchie. Remember where we were when he signed. We're in the Championship. Everyone wanted a piece of us. Everyone wanted to kick Newcastle when they were down. And, we signed this guy who wanted to kick back, and he would even kick the corner flag if he needed to. So what a signing he was, and some great goals as well to go with it. But ultimately, someone who kept the cool when people were on top of Newcastle United. And, he'll go on, and I think he'll go on and be a manager one day, but we'll have to wait and see. He's got that sort of demeanour about him that he could be a manager. But we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'd love to see Matt Ritchie have some sort of coaching role with Newcastle United, because I think he'd apply the same standards to the players he'd be coaching, to the standards that he set as a player. And he'd probably end up taking part in training sessions, and a bit like Kevin Keegan did back in the day as manager, he'd probably be the best player on the pitch. But yeah, farewell to Matt Ritchie and Paul Dummett and the others on that list. Thank you very much for Lee to popping onto the podcast and taking us through his thoughts on those players released from Newcastle United. To you guys watching, give the video a thumbs up on YouTube. If you're on the audio channel, thank you as always. Leave us a rating and review. Head over to chroniclelive.co.uk for all the latest Newcastle United news. And for myself and Lee, we'll see you guys very soon.